Wildfire Swap is a puzzle game inspired by the Columbia River Gorge fires that happened a few years ago. When I moved out here from the East Coast, it was just sort of it was just truly wild, and it's hard not to have that kind of live in your brain for a long time. And so the kind of the actual minute-to-minute gameplay is swapping tiles and trying to create like fire breaks, much like the woodland firefighters would do to kind of protect these homes. So that's kind of the high overview.
That's awesome. I absolutely love that you have used the game as a way to raise awareness on such an important issue. And I'm excited to talk more with you both about the game. But before we do that, we're going to take a quick look at a trailer for the game so people can see it up close. Great. I like to imagine that while developing the game, you're both just like passing fire puns back and forth the whole time. Amazing. So we've got Richter in our, I guess we can call it, he's in the production cave and he's doing some gameplay for us here so we can actually see how the game plays. But if you guys would like to tell us more about what the gameplay is like here, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, so I mean, you go ahead, Drew. I talk first, so.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so all the player can do is swap adjacent tiles, but there's a lot of consequences down the road of how the fire moves through the level. Here we just see it spread from tree to tree after the player moves, but in later worlds, there's dry grass and wind that makes the fire move differently, and so there's a very out of control feeling where the player's action is relatively small compared to how fast that fire spreads. And you just kind of slide into home base right at the very end, protecting the houses.
Now, one of the things I've always been curious about when people develop puzzle games is how much do you go into it designing the puzzle backwards? Do you know what the solution is first and then you work your way backwards to it? Or do you guys just kind of generate it and then see if other members of the dev team can solve it?
I guess I'll take this one again too. I did a lot of the level design on this. Everything is the short answer. I mean, we made so many puzzles, many of which didn't make it in, but some good strategies I found were just thinking what if the player had to do this and then making a level that let them do that or made them do that. I think another way or approach is all these levels have a clear purpose. It introduces this mechanic, or it lets the player kind of play around with something they just learned, or it challenges them, and that helped a lot in ending up designing these puzzles too.
Yeah, just the double drilling on one thing you mentioned too. It's the iteration is a huge aspect. Drew mentioned that we have more there's maybe 400 plus levels that we made over the course of this game, and a quarter of them are actually in the final game just because of, for all sorts of reasons, too hard or not the best iteration on getting the idea across. So a lot of iteration for sure.
So you mentioned that obviously not all the levels made it in, but there are a lot of levels in this game to play through. We have different environments and things like that, which you touched on a little bit, but I'd love to hear more about what you've done in development to introduce new challenges to each level, keep things fresh as the game progresses, because I'm sure that must be, a challenge with any game.
Yeah, so the kind of the course of the game is we start with this sort of basic spread mechanic. And the interesting thing about it is that there's a lot of there's a lot of interesting things that come out of the simple thing based on kind of like the positioning of the mechanics around. And so one of the things that Drew did really well was sort of like say, oh, if you have a blank and then a tree and then a tree, like that feels different to the player versus like a tree surrounded by fire all around. And really try to like showcase the progression of that. So you'd have a puzzle where like, oh, you have 1 turn of safety, and then you have 3 turns now in a similar space you have to think about. And then we really tried to, like Drew was hinting at, we kind of had like an introductory level, a play with it level, and then like a challenge level on each of these sort of chunks. And at that point, we kind of just did as much as felt like enough for the game, which is not super scientific, but yeah.
Yeah, this was my first time making levels of any sort, and over 2 years, I guess I grew a lot more comfortable with it. But something that I learned is, you know, we have these mechanics in the code, like fire spreads, or you can swap tiles, but the actual interesting stuff in the game, kind of what Ryan was mentioning, is there's patterns that come out of that. And so the levels are really teaching the different patterns. And we only have a few mechanics that Ryan came up with early on. And pretty fast, we were like, wow, there's a lot of patterns to cover. And so all of these worlds are almost kind of felt like catch up, because we didn't realize how big the scope was already.
So one of the things I've noticed in some of these levels that we've seen is that there seems like there are multiple different kind of solutions that are available. Was that one of the things you guys kind of took into account when you were cutting out levels? Like, oh, well, this solution is very similar to the previous level that we did, so we're going to leave that one out? Or how much of it just ends up being like I really didn't expect the players to come up with that solution, so we'll just kind of leave that in?
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. There are a ton of levels where we would have this thing and be like, oh, this is really cool, and then we'd have another level that played almost the same, except it was just like ever so slightly cooler, and we'd be like, all right, I really love both of these, but like, does the player really want to do the same thing 4 times in a row? Like, probably not. And then the amount of levels that got totally ruined because a player did something like really obvious in retrospect that we just didn't see because we were focused on this super cool sequence. That's like so many puzzles got cut for that reason, or iterated on a lot, hopefully, to try to clamp down on some of the less interesting stuff you could do.
Yeah, there were a lot of puzzles where I'd show Ryan, be like, look, I made this really cool thing. And he just like swap 1 tile at the beginning and solve it. Just like, what?
Oh, no.
But yeah, also shout out to playtesters. I mean, once we started playtesting, almost every level in this game changed. So, and for the better, you know, I think a lot of the levels were actually made more interesting by trying to work around some of those simple solutions.
On the subject
Speaking
of that,
of-
what was the playtesting process like? Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to ask the same thing. We had a question from chat from Patrice that Alchemist just asked. That was great. Love to hear more about it.
Yeah, okay, Drew's drinking, I'll go. We did a few different kinds of playtesting throughout the course of development. One of the earliest versions of playtesting was actually, we took a much earlier game, or version of Wildfire Swap to 6 in 2019, actually. And that was kind of one of our first hands-on sort of playtest situations. And then, so we're actually out of Portland, and there's local game events like that too. So we'd bring a version of the game out and kind of see them play. But what we kind of realized is that that's a great way to hone the first, like, I don't know, 20 levels in your game, and then everything starts falling off because everyone starts at the beginning because they have to learn everything. And so what we kind of moved into towards the later half of the development was scheduling like playtest sessions. So we would get a bunch of keys together and have people apply, and then we kind of send them out, let them play for the game for a week. Super great if they could record video like this. Like now we can really judge everything Richard's doing right now, which is beautiful for a developer. It's really helpful to see all the ways people mess up. That's the biggest thing with these puzzle games is like, I think there's a big tendency for players to get frustrated when they mess up, which is super natural. But like when we look at it as a developer, like a lot of those mess ups are like our fault. They're not really the player's fault. Like we don't want you to struggle in places we didn't intend you to. So yeah. that's sort of a broad thing. But I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Drew.
No, that was good.
So, we've talked a lot about the difficulty and also about how, you can fail levels, obviously. And that gets me really curious. I want to know if, as the developers of this game, if you have any levels that, like, even now after, you've created them and they're there, like, revisiting them, do you just get stuck on them?
Yes. A lot.
I love it.
So the game in particular has a few different kind of structures in the way we order it. So the kind of main course of the levels, like throughout the game, we wanted to make it so that most people who were motivated to keep playing could get to the end. But what we really started doing was adding these like challenge paths off of that kind of branch off. So like if you really want to kind of keep drilling in on one of these mechanics and just seeing how far you can push yourself, like those ones start to get pretty tricky. And especially, I think, hopefully there's some that I made that Drew trips on maybe, but I definitely trip on a lot of Drew's ladder challenge parts for sure.
Yeah, shout out to Celeste for being a big inspiration for me, at least, on ordering those, main path and challenge worlds.
So there's been a lot of times where I've played kind of puzzle-like games, and I had that moment where I'm on a level and I'm kind of getting like, okay, I feel like I know what the solution is, but I'm doing something wrong in the beginning. Was there any moments during development where you kind of had those kind of moments where you got stuck on something and then realized, oh, this is kind of projected a little bit differently, and then you changed how the levels were like laid out in the beginning from that?
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, when I started making levels, I didn't know anything about how to play this game, and basically making levels is becoming good at the game. So there were a number of instances where I'd have made a bunch of levels and I'd realize, talking about patterns again, I was like, oh, there's a pattern here to explore, or like this pattern I thought was cool is actually just an edge case for this like more general pattern and stuff. So there's a lot of reorganizing. And actually, because the game grew way beyond our expectations, we also kept splitting things out into more and more worlds.
Yeah, I think we reordered everything in the game many times. I think the first world is maybe the only thing, and even that got reorganized a lot. We just reorganized it a lot faster because it was in that first 10 levels. We actually got people to play a lot early on. So yeah, everything changed a lot.
So one other question I have. So I noticed that this level has, like, just like some of the other levels, has titles. How difficult was it to make the titles of the levels not give too much away, but also be enough that if a player kind of starts to get stumped, they can go, okay, maybe that's a clue as to what I'm supposed to do?
Yeah, totally. I feel like I did more of this than you, Drew. I don't know if that love about puzzle games that kind of let you get that little just kind of hint of a. Of course, is that it's really hard to do that. I don't think I succeeded in a lot of them. Like some of them are just called tricky, which is not a particularly helpful clue. But I was always really happy when I got to find something that was just right. The good news is, like, if you can find any sort of word or couple of words that are even remotely related, you can kind of just throw them in without worrying about spoiling too much, because like watching people over or under interpret a single word, even if the word is like basically the answer, is still like the room is wild for misinterpretation there. So we never really worried too much about giving too much help in that way.
Yeah, and during development, we were making so many levels so fast that naming them well was just kind of out of the question. So there's a lot of dev names that are just like Zimzam, which is totally nonsensical, but was really useful for, being able to talk about the level. It's like, oh yeah, Zimzam, I actually know what that is. We're both developing this game. And then we kind of did a pass right at the very end before release, trying to tidy up those. So,
yeah, I think I got to. Part of the reason I said I feel like I did more is because you were busy making Zimzam, and then I was busy like, okay, I'm testing Zimzam and thinking about like what to call it.
Now, I'm not trying to light a fire under anybody here, but I'm noticing that Richter is kind of struggling a little bit with this puzzle here. I'd love to hear you talk about, from a dev's perspective, what are you seeing when you watch him kind of having a hard time with this puzzle? Like, what does your brain process this like?
Well, okay.
Yeah.
I paused because I just watched him do something very significant, and that's kind of the awesome part, because that is one of the hardest things about like play testing this game. That's one of the reasons I love doing an async, is because I didn't have to watch people, because like the temptation to be like, no, it's the other way.
Yeah.
It's very high. But it's really about earning that. Like that's kind of the whole point of puzzle games is earning your way through that. I mean, pain sometimes. So, yeah, it's painful for everyone involved, I think, to try not to over-explain.
Yeah, that level in particular, I think, is a crux for a lot of people. I wanted to like really make people think about the tall grass and how basically putting a tree in front of it, spoilers, doesn't help you because it doesn't actually end up saving time. But the more forced something is, the more potential it has to be a sticking point, because it's kind of just random whether people get it right away or not. Like you really just roll the dice, and that's kind of a difficult challenge in making a puzzle game, which is why most of the path has branches, you know, as a fail safe, just in case you can't do one. So yeah, I think that one maybe is a little too difficult at the time, but yeah.
So earlier you were talking about, you know, kind of what inspired you to make this game. And unfortunately we were having a couple audio issues, but someone in chat mentioned, you know, that they might have missed it and they want to know what your main motivation is for making this game. And it's such a great story that I'd love to touch on that again and make sure we cover that.
Yeah, for sure. So back in 2017, I actually moved out to Portland from the East Coast, so I had never. I mean, you hear a wildfire because you see Smokey the Bear on television one time or something, and that's like basically all wildfire was to me. But my parents came and visited after I moved out. We were like in the Columbia River Gorge, like the day that it had caught on fire, and we just like the sky just started to turn like ash, and like we had no idea what was happening, and it's like we kept going further, which is not what you're supposed to do if you know that you're driving towards a wildfire. It was just it's a surreal experience to just kind of to be around wildfires like that, and yeah, it's just hard for that to not be a thing that you think about for a while afterward. And so that's part of one of the things Drew mentioned earlier was kind of how you're always just barely controlling these fires in the nick of time, and it's a lot more of like, you don't extinguish the flames, right? You just do your best to kind of cope with them, and that kind of overwhelming natural force is kind of the inspiration for that mechanic. So
I feel like when you said you don't extinguish the flames, that just was like so profound, and I feel like it's like a theme almost for the past year. You just learn to handle them. I like it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is unfortunately relevant in so many ways as we keep progressing through these past few years. So yeah, we'll get better at handling though.
So another question I want to ask that came from chat is for both Drew and Ryan. So you guys are going to have to come up with these answers individually this time, so no cheating. What was your favorite part of making this game? And you know, I'm going to be checking each other's answers, so don't copy from your partner here.
You go first, Drew. I talked a lot just now.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, this is the first game I've worked on that's been released, and everyone says that's a huge learning experience, and it totally is. So very grateful for how much I was able to learn, and working with Ryan is awesome. We were friends before this as well. So yeah, just how much I learned basically.
Yeah, no, we learned a ton shipping a game. I feel like every time you go further in that development journey, you learn a million new things that you never knew existed before. In particular, the thing I think I liked the most beyond, learning is hard to beat learning, but I really enjoy exploring systems in games. So Wildfire Swap started out kind of just as like, I just made some fire spreading and then just played around with fire spreading until it was kind of interesting. And so what's really fun to kind of do is I play other, I don't know, like Factorio or something, like other games that are about exploring systems. But what's really fun is to kind of play with that system and then capture it in a way that you can try to teach whatever that fun thing you just did to other people via a puzzle. That kind of exploration and teaching process is pretty fun.
I'm still staring at this puzzle because my brain is still going like, okay, what would I do if I were in this situation? And
yeah, me too.
That's also, as far as favorite parts of this game, being at like SIX and other conferences and not necessarily watching the people playing, but watching the people watching the play was so fun, because you would occasionally you'd have like one over helpful audience member that would just be like, no, do this, that's how you solve it, and then the person would be like, okay, fine, and then it wouldn't work, and then it's just a really great experience where I think the experiential part of I don't know exactly what it is about the game, but it's really fun to just be able to see all these possibilities, but you really just have to get in there and then play it yourself to figure out what works and stuff. I think it's pretty fun.
I definitely have played some puzzle games like at events like PAX where I'm working on something and then someone goes, no, you want to move it to the left, and you have that moment of, do you want to do it? And then they come up and it's always nice when they come up and they try the thing and they're like, oh, well that didn't work, and you're like, see, but there's that possibility where you say to that person, do you want to try it? And it happens to be the dev who made the game, and they just come over and go click 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 click, and you're just like, cool. Didn't catch your name. He goes, oh, hi, I'm Drew. I made the fire propagation. You're just like, well, that's cheating. I don't think that's fair.
We try to avoid that where possible. It's very tempting, though.
Yeah, I mean, as developers, like Ryan touched on this earlier, we really just want to help the player succeed. Like, I think early on my thought was like, oh, puzzle game, stump the player. And it's like, no, that feels really bad. Like, it's very easy to stump the player. I could make this giant complicated mishmash that no one can solve. But so it's like right on the edge where it's just challenging enough, but they have all the tools and knowledge and that little bit of experience from previous levels to solve it.
Yeah, so much on that. That's the hardest part of making this is trying to find that curve of like what is just challenging enough but not impossible. And very hard to nail that.
And it's different for every person, so it's kind of an impossible task, and we just...
So I have one last question. So in looking at the mechanics, right, the match 3 is kind of a simple mechanic of swapping the tiles, but when I first was seeing this, I saw, well, they have a reset and an undo. And in watching Rick Jarrett play, which, by the way, tremendous props to Rick for playing this game while we're sitting here talking about it. Like, we can sit here and say, like, yeah, that seems easy. He's like, yeah, okay, cool. But one of the things I thought was really cool is some of these puzzles seem like they're multi-staged. Was there something that went into the design when you initially were setting out to make this, where you went, we need to have an undo and a reset separately, so that when you get to that point where you're like, okay, I'm over this hump for this section, but I don't want to reset my entire progress? Was that a consideration in making both the reset and undo buttons?
Yeah, definitely. There's so many times when you just kind of need that, like, just I'm kind of stuck in on this one solution, and I just need that hard refresh to just clear everything out and reset. that's the super big thing with reset. And then yeah, undo is really helpful for that, like, oh, I'm like pretty sure I'm getting right in here on the solution, but I want to do as much little experimentation as I can. Yeah, they're just really good for different modes of thought on the puzzles. So yeah, you're super on point there.
Yeah, and as the game progresses, the levels get larger and larger. So I think a trend we see is that people often only use the reset in the beginning, which makes sense. The levels are very small. They're 4 or 5 moves, baby. But once they get to like 10 moves or more, the undo button becomes more and more useful.
Yeah, and this particular puzzle is maybe one of the first kind of multi-stage puzzles too. So I think this might actually be the first time we've seen the undo button getting used as much as the reset button in this stream. So it's cool to see it in action.
Yeah, this was 2 smaller levels like glued together because you make a bunch of extra levels and some of them feel kind of redundant or just like not as good as a different level that occupies the same space, but it can still be a component of a bigger puzzle like this.
So really making a puzzle game is kind of a big puzzle in itself.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Here we go. Well, thank you so much, Drew and Ryan, for joining us. This was amazing. Unfortunately, it's time for you guys to leave. Since we're at the end of this segment, but we're gonna take a short little break, and then after that, we're gonna check out Forest Grove. But before we do, we've got some important reminders for you. Definitely make sure that you go and check out our campaigns that we have going on for Seattle Indies Expo. One of them is on Steam, and the other one is on Tiltify. And you can look for links below the video player or in chat. And also, you can find more information at 6.seattleindies.org if you're curious about any of that.
And again, we have to thank our sponsors. Oh,